In this episode, we're going to do a review of an affordable shotgun microphone called the Takstar SGC-600. This entire episode is recorded with the Panasonic GH5 and the SGC-600, which is boomed just above me here. We haven't done any sort of post-processing to the sound. All I've done is normalize the levels up just a little bit so they're all consistent, and that's exactly what you're hearing. No EQ, no compression, no anything else. Now, first of all, I want to do a test here. One of the things that people don't realize, this is a camera top shotgun microphone. It's really what it's designed for. But if you stick it on top of the camera, it's not going to sound as good as if you boom it over the talent that's talking. So here, for example, I have it boomed just out of the frame. And here's an example with the microphone on top of the camera. We're about, I would say about 1.5 meters away. So 4.5 feet roughly, something like that. And so you can see there's a big difference in the overall sound. Now, that's probably the most important principle to understand when it comes to recording sound for your videos. If you get the microphone close, it's going to sound a whole lot better. It's picking up some of the other sound in the room here. There's a fan in this light, for example. Probably hearing a little bit more of that. And just not as, as soon as you get farther away from the camera and the microphone in particular, it sounds very different. If you want to learn how to boom it above your talent like this without spending a whole ton of money, I do have another video we'll put up here that you can watch that talks about buying a microphone stand and the adapters you need to get it above you, as well as an extension cable to get to your camera. Let's get to a couple of samples, along with some from very popular camera top shotgun microphones, including the RODE VideoMic NTG and the DEITY D3 Pro.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you were quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. Here's a vlog format, what you could expect. I think actually these types of cameras are actually quite good for vlogging. And the reason for that, of course, it keeps the microphone very close to you. So actually a pretty good setup. Now, the one potential downside here is we have a little breeze. Probably, if I had to guess, maybe 3 to 5 miles an hour, so not really strong. We do have the high pass filter turned on, so you can see what this sounds like. It definitely cuts into the lower part of my voice, so some of the bass frequencies will be gone, but it does help prevent the wind from making a whole lot of noise on the microphone capsule. Let's go ahead and turn that off. Okay, this is with the high pass filter turned off, so you can hear what that sounds like. Just a little bit of contrast there. Now, there are a couple things here. We have an air conditioner running behind us here, probably 75 to 100 feet away. Here's a quick test. We're going to kind of jiggle the camera around to see if the energy of the moving camera transfers to the microphone capsule. There's a little rattling from the camera itself. And then also let's push some buttons here just to see if that does anything in terms of transferring that sound. There is no dedicated fur cover for this, or like a dead cat kind of cover for this from Takstar, as far as I could tell from their website. So it doesn't look like one's available made specifically for this one, and it may be a little bit challenging because this microphone is substantially smaller than for example, a RODE VideoMic Pro or a DEITY D3 Pro. So it doesn't look like those covers would work either. So you're kind of on your own to kind of figure that out and see what options there are if you are going to work in the wind. So let's run through the pros and cons really quickly. First of all, this microphone is tiny. It's much smaller than a lot of the competitors, which is really nice. Keeps the profile of your camera rig very small. And it's also very lightweight, so it's easy to boom up above your talent if you are going to do a talking head shot like this. The microphone has a supercardioid polar pattern. What does that mean? It means it's most sensitive here on the front, and it does not pick up as much on the sides, and then there's a little bit that it picks up on the back. Let's give you a sample of that. Give you a sense for how directional the microphone is and how it sounds when it gets off axis from me. That is to say, when it's not pointed directly at me. So here I have it directly on axis, directly at my mouth. Now you can see as I turn it off to the side, it starts to sound a little bit different. Here's at 90 degrees, and we'll keep on turning until we're 180 degrees. So now it's pointed directly away from me. And now we'll go ahead and start turning it back. Here we are back to 90 degrees. And then as we continue to turn, here we are back on axis at 0 degrees. Now, one thing that's really nice about this relative to some of the other more popular, more expensive camera top shotgun microphones out there, this runs on a single AA battery. We have a single Eneloop, and this is an old Eneloop. I've had it for at least 7 years. It probably has at least 100 recharges on it, recharge cycles, and we've had it running for the last 53 hours. So the specs say that it will actually last up to 100 hours. I haven't had it on that long, but we know it will last at least 53 hours. The good news for you there is that it will easily last an entire day. So that's good news. It's very efficient. You have gain settings or input level settings for plus 10, 0, and minus 10 dB. So it gives you a little bit of flexibility. Then you kind of fine tune the overall level in your camera or your audio recorder. The overall build is pretty decent. It's plastic mostly with a little bit of metal. The cold shoe mount itself is metal, which is really important, so that's a very sturdy part. And it does have a 1/4-20 thread on the bottom, so you can attach it to various things, including friction arms and things of that nature. It also includes an adapter, so you can record to your mobile phone. And again, that's really helpful if you are looking for something that's going to be very small, very light, and you're not even using an interchangeable lens camera. As we demonstrated in the outdoor sample, it does have a 200 hertz high-pass filter. This is going to be helpful for things like air conditioning, wind, kind of cutting those out just a little bit. So it actually works pretty nicely. At first I saw 200 hertz and I thought, ooh, that's going to be too aggressive and it's going to cut out all the kind of the low frequency, and it does cut out some of it, but it's a very gentle curve, and so it works really well. And probably the biggest pro here, this is a $30 microphone, $30 US at the time of this review. Hard to beat that. In terms of cons, I think the one main one that I see is that there is no fur cover available for this microphone as far as I could tell. I looked around, didn't see anything on the Takstar website. It's significantly smaller than some of the other competing microphones, so I don't think any of the kind of off-the-shelf fur covers for those will work. So unfortunately, if you're planning to do a lot of stuff outdoors, you're either going to need to fashion your own fur cover or find another one that you could fit on this, and I think it's going to be a tough call. Now, how does this compare to the RODE VideoMic NTG and the DEITY D3 Pro, which are kind of the two most popular other camera top shotgun microphones? Well, obviously they're massively different in terms of price. The D3 Pro at the time of this review comes in at about $200 US. The VideoMic NTG from RODE comes in at $250 US. This doesn't have all the features of those. So the big things I would say are those do have fur covers available for them, so you can work out in the wind. They have a variable adjustable gain knob, so you can kind of fine-tune the gain a little bit better versus a switch on this one. I think the build quality is substantially better on those. And overall, what surprised me though is that the sound on the Takstar is surprisingly close, especially to the DEITY. And I almost felt like this sounded better on my voice than the VideoMic NTG. That's a little bit more subjective. So the overall sound, we put the samples in there so you can make a decision for yourself which of them sounds best, or if this is good enough for what you're trying to do. From my point of view, in terms of pure audio quality, this one seemed to be right there in the same category with the other two, but it is substantially less expensive. Now, it also does not have a replaceable cable, so if the cable does get damaged, basically the microphone is done for. So that's a little bit of a downside. On the plus side, this does have a replaceable AA battery. So in our case, we used a nickel metal hydride rechargeable, an Eneloop, and that's fantastic. The other two have inbuilt lithium-ion batteries. Now that's convenient, but there will come a point when those batteries stop working if you use your microphone a lot. So a little bit of a trade-off there. So overall, there's a look at the Takstar SGC-600. I hope that was helpful for you. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. And if you have not already subscribed, make sure you do that. And we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.